Mr. President, I rise today to talk about legislation to give our economy a shot in the arm and to help raise wages for Americans all across our country. When I'm back home, whether it's at a small auto body shop or whether it's at a big steel plant or whether it's at a soybean farm, I hear the same thing, which is people come up to me and saying, hey, Rob, all these regulations coming from Washington, you know, I'd love to hire more people, but I'm spending too much time and money trying to keep up with these regulations. And I think that's true with every member here, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. When you're back home talking to people, they get frustrated. Sometimes it's local and state regulations as well, but a lot of them are coming from the federal government. One example would be a company called Whitaker Greer Brick. It's a small family-owned business in Alliance, Ohio, just outside of Youngstown. They told me recently that complying with just one regulation is now costing this small company almost $1 million a year that they don't have. They've had to go out and borrow the money, and that's been difficult for them. The cost of just complying with this one new regulation is about 10% of their annual revenues. And otherwise, that roughly $1 million would have been invested, they say, in plant and equipment and people. In other words, they'd be able to create more jobs and modernize their facility if not for that compliance cost. So they're not alone. It's happening all over Ohio and across the country. Costly regulations are causing companies to pull back on expanding jobs and creating more opportunity for the people we represent. So, look, regulation has its place, no question about it. We need regulations. I think everybody acknowledges that. It has a proper role. We need reasonable laws that protect health and the environment, prevent dishonest business practices. But let's make sure, as we regulate more and more and more, that we have smart regulations, regulations that make sense and that don't affect these small businesses, as I talked about with this brick company in Alliance, Ohio. The reality today is that a lot of federal regulations are more extensive in scope, more expensive to these companies and therefore these workers, more unpredictable than they have to be, more unpredictable than they have to be to meet whatever the policy objectives are. So Congress, writes a law and we have certain policy objectives, but then the regulators take that and they change the spirit of the congressional law instead of meeting that objective in the most cost-effective way possible. So I get that from my constituents, and the question is, what do we do about it? Another thing I hear about is the fact that regulators aren't accessible. People don't feel like they have any influence over it. And by keeping new businesses from starting, small businesses from growing, regulations are just making it harder for people to be able to make a living. So how did we get here? Why are regulations so expensive and so burdensome on workers and jobs? I think a big reason is the way the federal government goes about writing regulations. Too often the process is unaccountable to the people. Too often it's based on sloppy or even bad information. The current law that gives us the basic framework for all this process is called the Administrative Procedures Act. And this has been around for a long time. But guess what? It has not been reformed in any significant way in 70 years. So the APA, Administrative Procedures Act, is something I studied in law school, as did other people here in this chamber. It's something that, you would expect would sort of change with the times, but simply hasn't. And that doesn't make sense. Imagine if we didn't update our health care laws for 70 years. We're talking right now about updating health care laws that were passed several years ago. Imagine if we didn't update our immigration laws for 70 years. Imagine if we didn't update our criminal laws for 70 years. The world changes. It doesn't make any sense not to update our regulations policy because we live in a growing and dynamic economy. Things are changing, and we've changed a lot in the last 70 years. We didn't have things like microwave ovens or color TVs. Our economy was 10% of the size it is today. We're still using the same regulatory process that was put in place for a totally different kind of economy. And by the way, in those 70 years, we've also learned a lot about how to regulate in a way that is more cost-effective, more efficient, and we need to put that into practice. So a reform of our regulatory process, in my view, is long overdue. So far this year, we have taken some steps here in the United States Congress to give small businesses very specific regulatory relief by rescinding some of the recent regulations that the Obama administration had promulgated. And we've done this about 10 times now through what's called the congressional review process. It is estimated this has saved the economy a total of $65 billion in regulatory costs and about 45 million hours of paperwork. And I've supported these congressional review acts, most of them, because I think that they make sense. But this is just a handful of recent regulations. We've only addressed a few of the symptoms, not the underlying cause. We still have to deal with the underlying problem of the way regulations get made. And if we don't do that, the regulatory burden will just continue to increase. And by the way, this should be true whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. The same rules ought to apply. All of this is why yesterday, Senator Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota and I introduced bipartisan legislation called the Regulatory Accountability Act, or the RAA, which would put in place some really important and very reasonable safeguards on the regulatory process to get better outcomes. Every president since Ronald Reagan, Republican and Democrat alike, have agreed that the idea that regulatory agencies should estimate their costs and their benefits is something that we all accept. So they've put this into what are called executive orders, saying that you got to go through a cost-benefit analysis. It's just common sense. It's the same way, by the way, your family does, families in Ohio do. When you're making a decision whether you're going to buy that car, whether you can afford to send your kid to college, you figure out, gosh, how much is it going to cost and what will the benefits be? That cost-benefit analysis certainly ought to go into regulations. And although every president from Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama have agreed on the need for that, it's never been put into law. So the first thing this legislation does is really very simple. The Regulatory Accountability Act, the RAA, says that there should be a law. We should codify the practice so that businesses have the predictability of knowing that regulations are going to continue to use that common sense cost-benefit practice. The Regulatory Accountability Act, the RAA, would then take the next step of requiring regulatory agencies, once they've figured out the cost and benefits of these proposals, to choose the most cost-effective way to achieve a policy objective. Let me repeat that. To choose the most cost-effective way to choose a policy objective as the one we would come up with here in Congress and law, that the regulations that people in the administrative agencies put out actually has to do that in the most cost-effective way. Common sense, right? Not done now. So this is a big change that's an important part of this legislation. Again, it's the same thing people do every day in their families. When you're deciding where you're going to go to school or what brand of milk that you're going to choose, you go through that kind of analysis. Let's find the most cost-effective way to accomplish the goal, one that costs less and has the least impact on the ability to create jobs. As I've said before, a lot of these regulations are really expensive. According to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, from 2009 to 2014, just 2009 to 2014, in those 5 years, the federal government published more than 80 major rules a year, every year. A major rule means it costs the economy more than $100 million a year. 80 a year at $100 million a year. For these major rules, the RAA would let stakeholders ask a court to review the cost-benefit analysis used by the regulators so that we ensure that agencies are using the best information possible, not relying on faulty information or making mistakes. That seems fair to me, that we should have some process to ensure they're doing the right thing. Again, this really makes sense given the huge impact of these regulations. The RAA would make regulators more accountable also by bringing the public into the process. When folks talk to me about regulations, a lot of times their concern is they feel like they're cut off from the process, that although they can come to me or their other elected officials and say, we're concerned about this law or that law, they have no access to the regulators. They're not elected. They don't feel like they're accountable. They can't complain to them, and there's no influence if they do. So under the RAA, agencies would have to listen to public comments and proposals before making a decision. Again, this is an important change. Instead of waiting until after the decision has been made and potentially triggering years of litigation, the RAA would just move up that process. An ounce of prevention, my colleagues, is worth at least a pound of cure. It's a lot better for our companies and for job creation to put some time into the effort up front to get it right than to have to fix it later. And I think it's better for the regulatory process and better for a smart regulatory process in terms of taking our laws and putting them into practice. So the RAA requires agencies to choose the most cost-effective regulations, creates more accountability by involving the public, and ensures we're using better information, and takes the existing practices and puts them into law. Ultimately, this is going to mean smarter rules and better outcomes and gives us a better environment for creating more jobs with better wages. The RAA is going to free up more resources, particularly for small businesses, to hire more people, raise wages, and purchase more equipment. That's going to boost economic growth and benefit all of us. There are some critics who have suggested this bill will somehow kill the regulatory process and prevent new regulations from being issued. But clearly they have not read this bill. The reason this bill is bipartisan is because it gives the American people a voice in the regulatory process, and it makes it more effective for both our economy and for our health and our safety. That's the kind of common sense regulatory process that hardworking taxpayers expect and deserve from their government. We've had a lot of support for this bill from workers all over the country and from a wide variety of industries, including organizations representing truckers, farmers, electricians, manufacturers. It's a bipartisan bill, and again, it's bipartisan because it's a common ground bill. It's a middle ground bill. I first introduced the RAA 6 years ago, and it has passed the House of Representatives 5 times. By the way, on one of those standalone votes, 19 Democrats in the House supported it. Some Democrats who serve in the Senate today have supported it in the past because they were House members then. And by the way, that's when the regulatory burden was less of a problem than it is today. And I've always had Democratic co-sponsors of the RAA when I've introduced it here in the Senate. I'm happy to have Senator Heitkamp, Senator Manchin, and Senator Hatch as the original co-sponsors of this legislation in this Congress, because this idea is needed more now than ever. It's a great opportunity to break through the partisan gridlock and to get something done that actually creates more jobs, raises wages, and makes a difference in people's lives. It's what I think the American people are looking for. That's what my neighbors in Ohio tell me. They want us to be getting stuff done that actually helps them and their families, and this is certainly an example of that. So I urge my colleagues to join Senator Heitkamp, Senator Hatch, Senator Manchin, and me in supporting this legislation that will create a more stable and reliable regulatory process to give the people we represent more opportunity. Thank you, Mr. President.